Hey, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second session of our anti-racism speaker series. We really appreciate everyone taking the time from their day to join us for this session. So I'm Dana Lynn McKenzie, Senior Manager, EDI and Indigeneity at the Faculty of Applied Science and Land and Food Systems. I'm a member of the Hleetsom First Nation. So I want to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're zooming in from today. I specifically want to acknowledge our Musqueam and Silks brothers and sisters whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories that UBC's Point Grey and Okanagan campuses are located on. If you'd like to, please acknowledge in the chat where you are. As a co-Salish and settler mixed person myself, I've spent much of my career actively promoting and raising awareness of Indigenous issues, supporting Indigenous people. And as a senior manager, EDI and Indigeneity, I'm really pleased to be working at UBC actively towards decolonization and increasing indigenization. Just before we start, before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to give our Dean, James Olson, the opportunity to formally start us off here.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dana Lynn. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's dialogue. As Dana Lynn had just mentioned, this is the second session in our anti-racism speaker series. And so I just want to thank you for being here today and participating. A special thank you, of course, to Dana Lynn McKenzie and Cheryl Staub-French and Sarah Akhtar, who worked hard to bring you today's events. And of course, a very special and warm welcome to our very special speaker. And of course, our very own faculty member, Dr. Margaret Moss. All I'd really like to do before we start is just connect today's events to our strategic plan, Transforming Tomorrow, as I almost always do. Just for those who familiar with the plan, you will know that there are really 6 priority areas in that plan. 3 of them are focused around how do we change the world across the scales of people, place, and planet. But the other 3 are really around how do we transform ourselves to meet that ambition of having impact across people, place, and planet. And of course, one of those priorities is our priority on inclusive leadership and respectful engagement, and specifically speaks to our commitment to Indigenous human rights and our responsibilities to respond to truth and reconciliation. You know, as I'm sure you know, the TRC calls to action repeatedly focus on anti-racism training, especially for educators, and that's really the purpose of why we're gathered here today. I did want to just talk a little bit about that priority. We have a number of strategies that are supporting that priority area. One of them is facilitating open dialogue about truth and reconciliation and the recognition of Indigenous peoples' human rights, which is really why we're gathered again today. But we also have focus or strategies on indigenizing our curriculum and enhancing opportunities for Indigenous kids and youth to engage with STEM education. And so I just invite you to please take a look at that, take a look at our strategic plan, to read more about the strategies that we're employing. And I think I'll stop there, and where I started, I'm particularly excited to listen and learn more from one of our faculty's own scholars, Dr. Margaret Moss. And so please, I think I will maybe I hand it back to Dana to introduce, and I think I hand it back to you.
Thank you, James. With that, it's my pleasure, absolute pleasure, to introduce Dr. Margaret Moss. As you can see from her bio on our site, she's an incredibly accomplished person we're very fortunate to have at UBC. One amazing thing that blew my mind to read about her was she's one of the 2 Indigenous women named on the inaugural Forbes 50 over 50 impact list. So Dr. Moss is the Associate Vice President of Equity and Inclusion at interim, previously the Director of the First Nations House of Learning, and is an Associate Professor at the School of Nursing. She's an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and is also Dakota. So she's the first and only American Indian to hold both nursing and Juris Doctorates, was appointed on the Board of Population Health and Public Health Practice, and at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She found that there was no textbook for nursing that focused on providing care for American Indian patients, so she went and wrote one, which is fabulous. She's also, as I mentioned, a trained lawyer with a PhD in nursing, and previously taught at Yale, the University of Buffalo, and the University of Minnesota. So we're thrilled to have her, and I'm going to turn it over to her now to present to you.
Oh, Margaret, I believe you're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, I just said thank you very much, and I'm about to share my screen. So let me get to the right view here. Okay, can you see that? Okay. So thank you so much, and I decided to sort of give a little journey from the perspective of an Indigenous person, how to become a nurse, or the path to becoming a nurse, everything that feeds into it, and just what it's like. And I'll end up with some of the work that I did with others, of course, on In Plain Sight. I believe I was the only Indigenous nurse on that team, though. And so a lot of the experiences that I've had feed into all of this. So it feeds into my work, it feeds into the report and so forth. So, but I want to start with saying I am calling in from the traditional territory of the Suquamish people in Washington State right now. And I also want to make a caveat that there is no, I think I did that, but I hope I'm on a weird computer. I hope it doesn't have a mind of its own. Sometimes it does. Anyway, there is no pan-Indigenous experience, although there are many threads that are similar. So I also want to make that indication. And so my story of becoming a nurse and becoming me is from the US, and I've been here for about 3¼ years, I believe. So I guess I'll just start there. And I also brought a lot of this experience that I've had into my co-leading work on the Indigenous Strategic Plan for UBC. So I was thrilled to be able to do that. So anyway, so this is the beginning of my journey, and this is Fort Berthold in North Dakota, and it's where I come from. And this is the 3 affiliated tribes there, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. As you can see, it's very different from where we are here. There are no trees. The state tree of North Dakota is the telephone pole. I mean, so therefore we had earthen lodges because it's a completely different field and feel over there. So just wanted to give you a picture of that. So that's where it all began. And I often put up a couple of pictures here to show you that it's not so long ago that this is Indian, and I'm using US vernacular often, so pardon me, but this is Indian reality, dress, ways of being. This person here, can you see my pointer? I can never tell if you can. Okay, this person here is my great-grandfather. So I'm long in the tooth, yes, but I'm not dead yet. Just a couple of generations back, this is what people look like. They were in what we call the Antelope Society of that nation. Here he is again with my grandfather. So it wasn't all that long ago that this is how people in the US, American Indians, what their reality was. And then here is a picture of my mother, has the magenta or whatever color showing for you under it, at an Indian school. And I think we've all heard about Indian schools. In the US, we also had many, we call them boarding schools, the largest and most notorious being the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Perhaps you've seen pictures, or you could look it up, and there's just hundreds, if not 1,000 kids sitting in front. And very similar things happen there. So running through my remarks is going to be reference to laws and policy, which have guided my life through adulthood, and thus the JD. I'll tell you about that later. This is different from other groups. So as I work in the EDI right now as well, there's a lot of convergence in the realities of Indigenous people and all other vulnerable groups, racialized or not. But there's some significant differences in that, some of the things we'll talk about. So the first two federal policy periods of removal and reservation guided where I came from. We were not from that land. We were pushed to that land. It was a reservation made from the Laramie Treaty of, 68, I think. So that guided right away my reality, my ancestors' reality. And then this one is, so that was two of them, removal, reservation. This one is assimilation, where, you have to speak English and cut your hair and all those things. And then also is, this is my mother. This is her here, and this is her later. And again, she was the first person in my biological line to be a US citizen. So I'm only one generation out from being a citizen in my own country. And that came from the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. And she was born in 1930. So the first one born in my line to be allowed to be called a citizen. So if I went back to that other picture, you could be a citizen before that, but you had to speak English, give up your Indian ways, farm, etc. And you can tell by those pictures of my grandfather and great-grandfather, they weren't doing that. So my mother here was the very first person to be a citizen, and yet we've been here for 10,000 years. So all of these things feed into people's understanding of reality. So now I had two stripes under that school picture, and one of the stripes to the left of my mother was my adopted brother and sister's family member. So here's two people side by side in Indian school, and we were adopted away into a white family. And so the three of us ended up there. So this was, again, another form of assimilation. And again, all these things are feeding into my realities, if you will. So I think, I don't know. I hope you can see that up there. But in mine, it's kind of that bar is going across, so I'm not sure. So this is the US style of assimilation. It's like the, what am I trying to say? The 60s scoop, but US style. So they didn't call it that. But both countries had this saying of kill the Indian, save the child. And that was the reason for boarding schools, residential schools here. But we were on the other side of that, these three, me and my brother and sister, that we were in the adoption and fostering side of it. Same thing, teach them English, cut their hair, put them in a suit, so forth. And they mostly went to white families. This ended in the United States in 1978. So the way I grew up in the US is now against federal Indian law. You are not allowed to adopt, a non-Indian family cannot adopt an Indian child unless there's many, many hoops gone through, but it's almost impossible because there was this huge bleeding of all the children away from the families which is, I think it's like the third point of the 5 points of genocide as determined by the UN definition of genocide. So the assimilation practices were considered genocide and they had to be stopped. So now it is. So just to let you know, we came from, as you saw, the reservation there, what it looked like, North Dakota, no trees and so forth. And we were brought to Washington, D.C. with my father, who was a doctor. I have a picture coming up, I think. This is actually, because this is the 60s, so I'm dating myself, but this is my older brother and sister. I think it was either graduation or prom or something, I don't know. And then here's the three of us. So we stuck out like sore thumbs. This was Bethesda, Maryland. I don't know if anybody knows anything about Washington, D.C., but it's like the first suburb out. And to this day, it's probably, I would guess, 90% white. It really didn't change. But when we were brought there, it was, so this is considered below the Mason-Dixon line, which means it's in the South in the US with everything that goes along with that. And this is prior to the US Civil Rights Act. So we were held to don't drink in the drinking fountains that are indicated for whites. Sorry, my nose decided to run. We couldn't go to the doctor who was just at the end of the block. Luckily, my father was a doctor, but his license was in Minnesota or something. So he just sort of passed us up as any parent would. We couldn't go to like the local swimming pool, had to go to movies in the balcony, etc. So in the South, pre-civil rights, we were literally by Maryland law considered colored. We were savages. The neighbors practically were up in arms when our family moved in. They hated every minute of it. So all this sort of stuff is feeding into why assimilation wasn't a great thing. And so speaking of assimilation, so here I am in my first communion. Get up when that's my father, and he was a physician. He was a German physician from anyway, he was came from Chicago, but his family came from Germany through Canada and then down. And so my growing up was very much here. Talk about Jeopardy. This was our dinner table talk. Was, you know, there's 7 of us because they had 2 of their own kids, 3 adopted, the parents, and so it would be like, name 5 products of Alaska. If you had, you know, $300 in the bank at 5% interest, what would you have after 45 days? You know, so this is what our dinner table was like. So it's like, oh, well. So, you know, for me, it worked. I thought it was kind of fun. For the other 2, they just sunk deeper and deeper into their chairs. And it could be a metaphor for the whole assimilation thing. It just wasn't working for them at all. So I remember that when I was 23, I think it was, I was asked to give a talk. It's the first talk I ever had to give in front of the Foster Parents Association as to whether this law was good. It had come in when I was 21, I think. We just missed the benefits of everything. And so my answer, I guess, pre being a lawyer was, it depends. So because for me, I was sort of able to embrace it. I always felt different. I always felt off to the side. I always felt weird in a way, especially being in the South, pre-civil rights. But I could get it, and so I was able to assimilate in that way, I guess. My brother and sister, it did not work well at all, and so I had to say it depends. So the picture on the left is my brother as he, you know, was adopted. And I'll tell you a quick story about him, because again, I'm feeding all this stuff into my brain while I'm becoming a nurse. I'm putting this stuff together. So he was born as Melvin Nathan Little Owl on that reservation. He was about 4 or 5 when they adopted him. He knew his name, he knew who he was, and so forth. They moved him to Washington, D.C., put him in a suit, as I'm saying, and his name now is James Philip Henke, the German. So, you know, now here he is, suddenly this new person. But unfortunately, he died in 1985 as Carmen in San Francisco in one of the first waves of AIDS. So he had this whole identity swirling. It was a mess for him. He would be Two-Spirit before Two-Spirit was even coined. Wasn't coined till the 90s. But he had just an awful, awful experience for most of his life. The person in the middle there is my biological brother, so our families were broken up. He stayed with my mother, and I met him again when I was 23. I guess I graduated college and started going around doing things. And he unfortunately died in a motorcycle accident. The one on the right is my sister, who was adopted with us, and she did not fare well at all and died of, alcoholism and so forth. The average age of all of us when they died was about 38. So the life expectancy of American Indians, whether they're from the reservation, not the reservation, in the Dakotas is about 40 years old. Today, even. A male born today in either of the Dakotas can expect to live to about 40. The women a little bit more, and 50, which is less than anyone else in the Western Hemisphere, less than Haiti, less than anywhere. But there's no uproar. It's like, I'm always saying, where's the moral outrage? It's horrible. So again, I'm getting these facts like, why isn't anybody caring? What's happening here? And all of this fed into my stuff. So meanwhile, my first degree was in biology. And after I did that, I went to NIH and was working at the National Cancer Institute, actually at the time and at the same lab, although I wasn't working on this. I was doing some protocols for cancer research, but the same lab a couple of floors up was working on the HIV stuff at that time. So it's very odd that I'm in the same lab, the human carcinogenesis lab, and they're discovering HIV. And my brother, who had transitioned, was dying of AIDS just like a year later. So again, all this stuff feeds into what do I want to be when I grow up. And I think that you can see what I wrote. Well, I don't know, maybe you can't. But what I'm saying is I learned all the same things by this point. This was after I graduated. So I had all the degrees, had all the assimilation, had the jobs, knew all the stuff. And so what I would tell my Indigenous nurses all the way along in all those various universities is, you know what you know, but they know what they know. So in other words, we have to know what you all know in the West in order to get licenses and be nurses. But we also know what we know, and nobody else does. And I'll get into that in a minute. So instead of people try to put you down or make you feel less than, or, oh, you're crazy, medicine men, what is all that? In fact, we know both systems, whereas other people only know the one system. So anti-racism is getting to know this other system. Nobody bothers, and I think that your previous speaker mentioned something that nobody's bothering to put in the work and find out, what do you know? What's your perspective and so forth. It's just that I could have gone on forever just going, oh, okay, I get it. I can do this. I can get a license, I can work. But I insisted just knowing from what I knew, just from that experience. And I had gone back to the reservation again at 23, met my mother, met my brother, and started learning things. I didn't know it either because I'd been taken away. So if I can do it, anybody else can go and find the same information of what is the experience, what's happening, what's different, what are these laws. The American Indians are guided by laws more than any other group. They're the most regulated population in the US. And if you're in healthcare, in one of the most regulated systems. So it's really complicated. So if people can navigate this, they are far ahead of many other people that go, oh, I don't know. If you ask them anything about American Indian health experiences or systems. Oh, there we go. So I went out and know what everybody knows in this various fields, and but nobody knows what I know otherwise outside of those fields. So I put this up to say, I guess I had to become a nurse. I wasn't really thinking about it because this is my she who raised me mother, and this is she who bore me mother. and they were both in nursing. So what are you going to do? So I became a nurse. I put up this picture just to show this is my reality pretty much everywhere I've ever been in my biology degree and all 3 nursing degrees, the Get One, the master's, the PhD, this is pretty much who I was with all the time. And so there's no one to say, oh, what about this? What about that? Thinking of indigenous knowledge, indigenous realities, indigenous anything. So in case you're wondering, this is me way back here. It's because I know we're on Zoom, but I'm tall, so I'm always in the back. And then there was one Black student, and that was pretty much it. And that's been my reality. I've never ever had an indigenous teacher, K through 12, never in any of my graduate degrees, never another student, never another anything. So you just sort of have to pile through. And I'll tell you one little story from my doctoral training, which was, I remember being in the class and they said something to the effect of, well, Margaret, you're exotic. What's your view on this? Or something like that. And I said, not only am I not exotic, I'm the only indigenous one here. You all are exotic to this country. And they're like, no, that's not right. And they left. This is University of Texas. They came back 2 weeks later and they're like, oh, you're right. We went and looked it up. So they don't know the simplest thing. What does indigenous mean versus what does exotic really mean? So this is what I'm working with. When I say, that's a very simple, I know what you know, and you don't even know what I know. But of people not even trying, you're not even trying at that point. So it's just the reality of it all. So I know I mentioned indigenous knowledge, and I often would tell this to my nurses, my student nurses, that when they don't get, people say, oh, why can't, and we'll get into this in plain sight, why can't they just go to the doctor's appointment? Why can't they just take the medicine like we tell them? Why can't they just do it? What's wrong with them? They're slow, they're not paying attention, whatever it is. They're unreliable, blah, 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 everything you can think of. So I said, well, let's switch it for a minute. And sometimes I would bring a picture like this. I did an ethnography on the Zuni reservation for my dissertation on aging. And so this is what you'll find at Zuni if you ever went there. So I tell them, I say, okay, what if for some reason you're in Zuni or wherever, that's a tribe in the Southwest in the US. And let's say for whatever reason, you got sick, incapacitated, had an accident, whatever. And this is your healthcare team coming at you right here. Are you going to instantly, go for it? They're not going to speak this language. They're going to say, drink this weird thing. They're going to say, okay, we have to pull this out of you. And what are you going to say? Oh, okay. You're going to go, you're going to run. You're like, I'm not going back there. I don't know what they're saying. I'm not going to drink that. I don't know anything about it. I said, well, that's how they feel about you. Here, get in this tube, put these headphones on, and then we're going to be shooting dye into you. It'll be fine. Both systems feel the same way about each other, but nobody's paying attention. And so, so once I try to bring that up, I say, well, I hate to bring it to you, but these people, and many others like them across both Canada and the US, feel that Western medicine is the alternative medicine. They have been doing this for 15,000 years. You guys were doing leeches 400 years ago, so it's like they think you're the newbies that don't know what you're talking about. And I can give you another example, which is when I first went, I actually worked in Indian hospital. We still have those. They're a little different, I think. But anyway, it was in New Mexico. And when I got there in 91, there was this horrible illness called hantavirus. And COVID is terrible, but this would kill you in 24 hours. If you fill your lungs up, you're dead. There's nothing anybody could do. And so, the alphabet soup of, the US went over there, NIH, CDC, IHS, to try to study what the heck this was. And the elders of the various tribes are around there were saying, we know what it is. No, you don't know anything. and they were there and they were there and they were there. So this went around and around, and finally they listened to them from their oral histories. They knew if there's a particularly big rain, because we're talking the Southwest, the pinon bushes, the pine nuts, whatever, would proliferate, drop to the ground. The mice would come in droves, be vectors, they could explain the entire process. And then they're like, oh, okay. And this happens over and over, that indigenous people actually know. They've been here for thousands of years in this place with these plants and animals and so forth. And they really know what's going on, but the West doesn't believe it unless it's scientifically, proven and so forth. But these are some of the differences that, let me change this, sorry, that there are between the two systems. And each one is valid. I was surprised to find that when I did this, there is a whole system of healthcare in this particular tribe and many others, with actual practitioners, like for mental health, for midwifery, for bones, and so forth. I talked to this one in my ethnography person that said that they had some kind of a bump on their back. They went to Indian Health Service. They did an X-ray. They said, oh, that you got to get that removed. It could be cancerous, whatever. She went home, told her grandmother, said, what'd you go to them for? Like, that's the crazy stuff. And so she went to a bone presser. Bone pressers are the musculoskeletal people there. And he said, oh, but I can't fix it until you go to the medicine man. So there's this whole decision tree that they have to do. You have to go to the medicine man. It's not like on TV. They don't just, fix, they pull out the evil in a way, just as a shortcut explanation. And then the bone presser can do what they have to do. So anyway, she went through this decision tree the proper way, and then went back to the Indian Health Service, and they go, well, I don't know what you did, but it's gone. And I heard so many stories like this over and over and over. But these things are just being totally ignored from Western allopathic medicine. They think, oh, that's crazy. So anyway, I was just taking all this in along the way. So I put this one up, not for any, oh, this is me kind of a thing, but as an explanation, which you'll see in a minute. So I got my degrees in biology, nursing, and law. My focus is in aging, leadership, policy, and disparities. I was on the tenure track in 2000 at University of Minnesota. Then I concurrently did a postdoc at University of Colorado, and it was specifically for Native elder health research. And there's no cohort of PhDs, so they had to fly us in. So I had to fly into Denver every other month for 2 years. And then I went to law school on the weekends, only because I knew that these legal implications I just told you about, of removal, reservation, assimilation, whether the American, I skipped one, I think, on the Native American Religious Freedom Act, the Citizenship Act, all these things are playing into how did the elders view me as although an indigenous nurse, one from the Western side of things. Because when I started taking care of indigenous elders, they were probably in their 60s. And I've been a nurse for 30 years, now they're in their 90s, but they were not born as US citizens, again, like anybody beyond my mother. So you're going to come to them, we're the government, we're here to help. They're not going to instantly believe, accept, do whatever it is we're telling them to do, because they couldn't even do their religious practices or become a citizen or do anything else. And so why would they ever believe it? But the nurses are never taught this. Like, they're just taught that they're non-compliant or whatever, but there's none of this history and the legalities behind it for anybody to understand. So anyway, I went to law school, and I had 4 kids at the time. So crazy, yes. So I did tenure, and my first tenure, and received my JD at the same time in 2006. In 2008, I went and staffed the US Senate Special Committee on Aging and was the lead on the National Alzheimer's Project Act. Again, bringing in some ideas of minority needs around that, which was absent of it in the beginning. And then I did a Fulbright at McGill about Indigenous and Aboriginal context of life across North America. I don't know, it had this large title. But I say all this to say, are you crazy? And so I put up here resilience. And then I have learned in my older age, I think it was actually a trauma response. I saw this one fall over, that one fall over, this one fall over. My Indigenous mother cried every time we met, every time. That was, historical trauma, unresolved grief from having me go away. And then the one she kept, as she told me, died, as I told you, in that accident. And it's been a swirling mess. So, and then I saw my sister die, then that mother died. And it's just like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got a lot to do. And so I just kept doing it. And as I look back now, as a woman of a certain age, I'm like, what am I crazy? But I really feel that it was a trauma response. So you might have to think about that, even with Indigenous nurses going forward. What are they doing? What are they asked to do? They'll take on more and more and more because there's no one else to take it on. For one thing, nobody that understands all this stuff. We don't teach it, and we don't teach it by design. K through 12, anything in college, unless you literally go out and seek, usually an elective. So I'm thrilled that at UBC, the School of Nursing has a mandatory course on Indigenous people's health, and it's really good, if I say so myself, in helping with that, not making it, just teaching it. And but anyway, things to think about when you do hire or seek out an Indigenous person to do things. They have a lot of swirling mess. So mine is one reality. And then there's people who grew up on the reservation or reserves. Then there's the people who were, disenfranchised. I know in the US, there was also a thing called termination period where they cut ties. The US government cut ties with over 100 tribes. So they say, now we don't have to worry about you, would take care. And those people are just floating around out there, So there's so many realities. This one was just mine. And then being in the US, and I'm almost done, being in the US, being an AIAN as American Indian Alaska Native, you're totally invisible. I don't know if this went over around Indian Twitter. I can't begin to tell you. This was a thing on CNN during the presidential polls. How did they vote? And we are something else, apparently. So if I can't tell you how many memes are out there about the something else. And I put it here because I noticed as I go to APHA, Public Health Association, GSA, these places that gerontological, I'm into aging, these places with 3,000 to 5,000 papers at their conferences, they might have 5 about American Indians. Usually it's a student, not that that's bad. And maybe they talk to 5 elders or something, and then all the other charts that you see is white, especially US, white, Latino, Black, and then other. Sometimes you're lucky to get to Asian. You never see American Indian on there, ever. And so again, as a nurse researcher who's Indigenous, I never see myself even on these things. I remember there was a Dr. Sapcher, what am I trying to think? Surgeon General in the US. He came to talk to the American Academy of Nursing as a keynote. And he was talking about prostate cancer or something. And he said, okay, African Americans are really high up on the chart. They die, and here's as compared to whites and Hispanic and so forth. And he said, oh, American Indians are down here. They don't have to worry. They don't have to worry because they're dead. It's a disease of old age, and they are gone by 65. You don't make it to 65. And I would think that the Surgeon General would have enough oomph to say something like that. But there's never any explanation, even if we are on the charts, of what's different, what's off, and so forth. So anyway, that's one of my rants. My last thing I think I'm going to talk about is, in a couple minutes, is in plain sight. And so there was some problems going around with how Indigenous people are treated in the healthcare system in BC specifically. So the Minister of Health authorized this investigation, and I was lucky enough to be on that team. I was the only Indigenous nurse on it, and we had a social worker and some lawyers, and I'm trying to think, physician and various, I just can't think of various other people, and put together this report, and I hope you've heard of it. I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs, and then I think I'm just about done. So in this report, what we heard is one of the headings of the outcomes. So first, what did Indigenous patients, families, and communities tell us? They told us that they encounter racism and discrimination in the BC healthcare system, including stereotyping, unacceptable personal interactions, and poor quality of care. Many Indigenous people said they do not feel safe when accessing healthcare services and interacting with health providers, some noting that they never feel safe, and many sharing that they always have negative experiences. Indigenous women spoke up more than anyone else and shared their particular feelings of unsafety. Indigenous people want to see change. They want to be treated with professionalism, compassion, and respect. About the same time, that woman, Etcheswan, I forgot her, sorry, I can't say her name, but anyway, over in the east somewhere, was trying to get help. You know, she was in the hospital and no one was listening to her, and then she ended up dying. So this was all happening about the same time. They want to be believed when they report healthcare concerns and symptoms. Participants want to see policies and actions in the health system that are meaningful and so forth. Then there's Indigenous healthcare workers, such as myself, and we asked them through the healthcare survey, what did they think? Indigenous healthcare workers believe that racism is a problem in their workplaces and organizations, and over half of Indigenous respondents to the healthcare worker survey experience workplace discrimination themselves. This racism often came from a colleague, fellow student, or an individual in a position of authority over them. There is fear of reprisal and speaking up against racism. Prejudice results in emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical harm. Some key informants emphasize that being Indigenous in the healthcare profession is career limiting. I'll stop there. But it's a 278 or something page report. It's online. If you just put in plain sight and report, you'll be able to see it. There's a smaller one at about 75 pages, but it's just stunning because there's quotes and actual people's stories in there that you wouldn't believe that it's 2020 when this came out, that this sort of thing is still happening. I believe it. It's been a long road from pre-civil rights to now. I have to say it's sort of gotten better. I could tell you 2 little teeny stories that tell you how maybe things have gotten a little better. One is, if you think of that picture that I showed you when I was at NIH working under the hood, something went awry with somebody else in somebody else's lab, and somehow they tried to blame me. And you know, they lost P32 or whatever, and that could shut down a lab if you didn't count it right and so forth. I had nothing to do with it. I was nowhere near it. I wasn't using it. And so anyway, it came out that no, I didn't. But then the chief lab guy, the lab chief, was mad that it came back on his lab. And so he told me to go back to the reservation and shoe leather. This is NIH. This is the National Cancer Institute, you know, one of the most august research facilities in the world. And somebody's telling me to go back to the reservation and shoe leather. And I can tell you, I won't tell you the university, but one of those previous ones, another faculty in nursing told me to cut my hair so I'd look like the rest of the faculty. If that isn't a trigger, you know, what did they always do in those assimilation practices? Cut the hair, change the language, become Christianized. So therefore, I rarely ever do. And anyway, but that's the kind of racism that I've had all the way through. But if you probably ask the casual observer, they probably go, "Oh, there's none of that anymore." But I'm here to tell you that yes, there is. Not at UBC. I haven't had any at UBC, but in my career. So I think that might be, oh, so these are my tips and then I'm done. So to put Jedi, again, I can't see it from my bar, but maybe you can, in the healthcare context, Jedi being justice, equity, diversity, and then decolonization, and then inclusion and indigenization. Grow an understanding of indigenous experiences, and they are not all the same. Understand that to decolonize in an educational system is to make room for all that has been strategically, purposefully cloaked or excluded. Again, I said we don't learn any of this stuff from K on by design. Note changes that should be made. Making room may start with evaluating the environment in your areas and learn something new, anything, just anything new. And that's the book that Dana Lynn, I think it was, spoke to, The American Indian in Health and Nursing. It's the very first textbook for nursing ever on American Indian health. Came out in 2015. So that's something all by itself. Why did it take so long? And then I did another one on health equity. So I think I should be quiet now. And yeah, that was my end, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much for that amazing conversation and learning about your story. We're really grateful to have this time with you, Margaret. And there's a lot for us to take away tonight.